Imagine becoming the most famous woman in Europe. Millions cheered your name. Kings, presidents, and movie stars wanted to meet you. You could have lived a life of luxury forever. But instead, you risked everything to secretly spy on the Nazis. She hid military secrets inside her sheet music, smuggled intelligence across enemy borders, and fooled Nazi officers right under their noses. To the world, she was just an entertainer. But behind the spotlight, she was one of France's bravest secret agents. This is the unbelievable, true story of Josephine Baker, the superstar who secretly helped defeat the Nazis. Long before she became a global superstar, Josephine Baker knew what it meant to have nothing. She was born in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1906. Her childhood wasn't filled with music and applause. It was filled with hunger, fear, and discrimination. America, at that time, was deeply divided by race. As a young black girl, Josephine wasn't treated as an equal. She worked as a domestic servant while still a child. Sometimes, she cleaned the homes of wealthy families. While barely having enough food herself, she later remembered seeing children her own age living comfortable lives, while she struggled simply to survive. But Josephine had something nobody could take away: her energy, her smile, and her extraordinary talent for performing. She loved dancing. She loved making people laugh. Whenever music started, it was as if the world around her disappeared. By her teenage years, she joined traveling performance groups. Night after night, she danced on small stages across America. People noticed something different about her. She wasn't just talented. She had a presence that filled every room. But despite her success, America still judged her because of the color of her skin. Many theaters refused to let black performers appear on stage. Others forced them to use separate entrances. Josephine realized something heartbreaking. No matter how talented she became, she would always face barriers. Then, everything changed. In 1925, she received an invitation to perform in Paris. She accepted immediately. It became the decision that transformed her life forever. The moment she stepped onto a Paris stage, the audience fell in love with her. Her dancing was unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Within months, she became the biggest entertainment sensation in France. Her face appeared on magazine covers. She performed before royalty. Artists painted her. Fashion designers admired her. She bought beautiful homes, luxury cars, and lived a life most people could only dream about. She finally had everything: fame, wealth, freedom. But then, Europe began changing. Across Germany, a dangerous new leader was rising. His name was Adolf Hitler, and soon, Josephine Baker would have to choose a life of comfort or a life of unimaginable danger. When World War II began, Josephine could have escaped to safety. Instead, she walked into French military headquarters and volunteered to become a spy. The officers couldn't believe what they were hearing, but they were about to discover that the world's biggest superstar was the perfect secret agent. In 1939, Josephine Baker had everything. She performed before kings. Hollywood stars admired her. Crowds filled theaters just to watch her dance. If she wanted, she could have left Europe before the war began. Instead, she stayed. When Nazi Germany invaded France, millions of people fled. Josephine did the exact opposite. She walked into French military headquarters and quietly offered her services. The officers were stunned. One of the world's most famous entertainers wanted to become a spy? At first, they thought she was joking. But Josephine wasn't. She told them, "If my country needs me, I'm ready." Soon, French intelligence realized something extraordinary. Josephine could travel across Europe without raising suspicion. No one questioned a celebrity. Diplomats invited her to lavish parties. Military officers wanted photographs with her. Government officials happily shared dinner tables with her. While everyone admired the superstar, no one realized she was watching, listening, remembering every conversation. Every careless word spoken by high-ranking officials could become valuable intelligence. Josephine had an incredible memory. She rarely needed to write anything down, but sometimes the information was too important to risk forgetting. So she found an ingenious solution. She hid military secrets. Inside her sheet music, invisible ink carried details about German troop movements, airfield locations, military plans. To everyone else, the papers looked like ordinary music. To French intelligence, they contained priceless secrets. Then came an even greater challenge. Josephine began traveling across Europe and into neutral countries like Portugal and Spain. At every border crossing, German officers searched luggage, checked passports, questioned travelers. One mistake would expose her as a spy, but the guards saw only a glamorous international celebrity. They smiled, asked for autographs, complimented her performances, then waved her through. Hidden inside her music case, the intelligence crossed borders unnoticed. Mission after mission, Josephine delivered information that helped the Allied cause. Without firing a single bullet, she was fighting one of the most dangerous wars in history. But fame couldn't protect her forever, because as the war grew darker, the Nazis became more suspicious. And soon, Josephine Baker herself would become a target. The Nazis were getting closer. Josephine was no longer just carrying secret messages. She was now helping the French resistance itself. If the Gestapo discovered who she really was, her career would end instantly. Her freedom would disappear, and the world's biggest superstar would face execution. By the early 1940s, Josephine Baker was living a dangerous double life. On stage, she was one of the world's biggest entertainers. Off the stage, she was risking her life for the Allied cause. Every concert became more than a performance. It became the perfect cover. Wherever Josephine traveled, important people wanted to meet her. German officers, diplomats, politicians, military officials. They laughed with her, shared expensive dinners, talked freely in her presence. They believed they were speaking to an actress. They never imagined she was carefully collecting information for the French resistance. As the war intensified, Josephine's missions became even more dangerous. She no longer carried only secret messages. She began helping resistance members directly. She offered her homes as safe meeting places. Resistance fighters gathered there in secret, planning missions while German forces searched for underground networks across France. Josephine also used her fame to raise money. Officially, she organized charity concerts. Unofficially, some of that money helped support the French resistance and refugees escaping Nazi persecution. Then, the situation became even more dangerous. The Gestapo began arresting anyone suspected of helping the Allies. Every week, resistance networks disappeared. Friends vanished overnight. Some are never seen again. Josephine knew she could be next. Many people begged her to escape. "You've done enough. Leave before it's too late." But Josephine refused. She believed fame meant nothing if it couldn't be used to protect others. Then tragedy struck. During one of her wartime tours, Josephine became seriously ill. She suffered severe infections and constant pain. Doctors warned her to stop traveling immediately. They feared the long journeys could kill her. But Josephine ignored the warnings. Even while recovering, she continued performing for Allied soldiers. She visited military hospitals, sang for wounded servicemen, lifted the spirits of young men who didn't know if they would ever return home. Many later said, her performances gave them hope when they needed it most. To the audience, she was simply a superstar. But behind every smile, she was carrying the weight of an entire secret war. Then, the impossible finally happened. The Nazis began closing in. Rumors spread that Josephine Baker was more than just an entertainer. For the first time, her greatest disguise was beginning to crack. The war was almost over, but Josephine Baker's most courageous battle would happen after the Nazis were defeated. Because when the world celebrated victory, she chose to fight another enemy, racism, and this battle will be just as dangerous. In 1945, World War II finally came to an end. Across Europe, people filled the streets. Church bells rang. Families embraced after years of fear. The Nazis had been defeated. For most people, the war was over. For Josephine Baker, another fight was just beginning. France celebrated her courage. The French government honored her for risking her life during the war. She received the Croix de Guerre, the Rosette of the Resistance, and later, France's highest honor, the Légion d'honneur. The little girl who had once been treated as less than human had become a national hero. But when Josephine returned to the United States, she was met with a painful reality. The country where she was born still judged people by the color of their skin. Black Americans were often denied equal treatment. Restaurants refused to serve them. Hotels turned them away. Concert halls separated audiences by race. Josephine couldn't believe it. She had risked her life fighting for freedom in Europe. Yet freedom still didn't exist for millions in her own country. She refused to stay silent. When a famous nightclub tried to seat black guests separately, Josephine walked away from the performance. She canceled shows that practiced segregation, even when it cost her thousands of dollars. Many people warned her, "Don't get involved. You're a celebrity. You could lose everything." But Josephine had already faced the Gestapo. She wasn't afraid of critics. She began using her fame to speak publicly against racism. Every interview, every performance, every public appearance became an opportunity to demand equality. Then she made another remarkable decision. She adopted children from different countries, different religions, and different ethnic backgrounds. There were 12 of them. She called them her rainbow tribe. Her dream was simple. She wanted to prove that children from every race, every culture, and every religion could grow up together as one family. People from around the world traveled to her home in France just to witness what she had built. To Josephine, it wasn't an experiment. It was hope, proof that hatred was learned, not born. But despite all her success, years of helping others and fighting for justice would eventually leave her struggling financially. Many believed the world had forgotten its greatest heroine until one final moment reminded everyone exactly who Josephine Baker truly was. At 68 years old, the world stood and applauded her one last time. She had survived poverty. She had outsmarted the Nazis. She had fought racism. But just days after receiving the greatest standing ovation of her life, something heartbreaking happened that no one saw coming. By the 1970s, Josephine Baker had spent her entire life fighting for others. She had risked her life as a spy. She had stood beside the French resistance. She had challenged racism across America. And she had devoted everything she owned to raising her rainbow tribe. But kindness came with a price. Years of charity, helping others, and maintaining her enormous home left Josephine in serious financial trouble. Eventually, she lost the castle where she had raised her children. Many believed the world had forgotten one of its greatest heroes. Then, something extraordinary happened. Friends from around the world stepped forward. Among them, Princess Grace of Monaco, the former Hollywood actress, Grace Kelly. She offered Josephine a home in Monaco, making sure she would never be alone. It was a reminder that true kindness always finds its way back. Then, in 1975, Josephine was invited to Paris, the city that had transformed a poor young girl into an international superstar, wanted to celebrate her incredible life. A special anniversary show was organized. Celebrities, royal guests, military officers, and longtime admirers filled the theater. When Josephine walked onto the stage, the audience rose to its feet. The applause continued, minute after minute. Some people were crying. Others simply stood in silence, honoring the woman who had inspired generations. It wasn't just for her music. It wasn't just for her dancing. It was for her courage, for everything she had sacrificed, when she could have chosen an easy life instead. Just 4 days later, the world woke to heartbreaking news. Josephine Baker had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage. She passed away at the age of 68. France mourned her as a national hero. Thousands lined the streets of Paris to say goodbye. She became the first American-born woman to receive full French military funeral honors. Soldiers marched beside her coffin. The French flag covered it with pride. It was a farewell reserved for heroes. The little girl who once scrubbed floors in St. Louis had become one of the most honored women in French history. Today, Josephine Baker is remembered as far more than a performer. She was a spy, a resistance hero, a civil rights activist, and a woman who proved that fame means very little unless you use it to make the world better. Because when history called, she didn't hide behind the spotlight. She stepped into the shadows and quietly helped change the course of a war. That is the true legacy of Josephine Baker. History remembers the people who win battles, but sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones no one sees. A dancer, a singer, a spy. Josephine Baker was all three, and her courage reminds us that one brave person can leave a mark on the world that lasts forever. This was the incredible true story of Josephine Baker, the superstar who secretly spied on the Nazis. She entertained the world while secretly helping to save it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to her silent strength for more untold stories of the bravest women in history.